My name is Sam Woodhouse. Welcome to Sam's Salon. My guests I would introduce first. To my immediate left is KATHRYN JOYCE, who is a teaching instructor and Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Philosophy at UCSD. She specializes in social and political philosophy and the philosophy of education. Her research investigates the nature of equality, its relation to other important social political values like freedom, and its implications of policy and practice. She has served on the organizing committee for UC San Diego's summer program for women in philosophy. Thank you for being here, KATHRYN. To her left is Sara Vogel, who has worked for 10 years in the University Student Affairs. In the University Student Affairs Office, I wrote that twice, college student conduct in Title X areas. In 2017, she began her position as the Title IX, and student conduct investigator at San Diego State University. She provides support and resources to students who have experienced sexual violence, relationship violence, and stalking. She also investigates claims of sexual misconduct and relationship violence between students. She will graduate with a Doctor of Education in Educational Leadership from the Joint Doctorate Program at UCSD and CSU San Marcos in May of 2019. Sarah. Wow. Sorry. And to my far left is the Honorable David J. Danielsen, who has served 27 years on the San Diego bench, where he served in leadership positions in the local courts, including 2 years as the presiding judge of the San Diego Superior Court and several stints as the criminal supervising judge. He's a past president of the California Judges Association, and amongst the many thousands of cases he has handled over the years are many high-profile matters, including an unfortunate number of cases of sexual violence. The judge is now an adjunct professor of law at the University of San Diego School of Law, teaching criminal procedure. He obtained his bachelor's from Dartmouth College and his law degree from USD. Welcome, David. Thanks for being here. Thank you all for coming to the salon. I want to welcome the students from San Diego City College. They were hanging out outside. We said, come on down. So they're here. Thanks a lot for being with us. So we have people who are actually the age of the characters in the play tonight. We're both 18. I'm sure you're all over 18, but the characters in the play are 18. The play actually that you're going to see is set on the campus of Princeton University. You're going to meet a pair of freshman students, a young Jewish woman and a young black man, who spend a night together, and after this night, the question of what actually happened that night becomes urgently important. The quest of the play is to uncover what actually happened. That becomes the topic and the action of the piece. It raises many interesting questions. For me, is truth subjective and or open to radically different perceptions? As the attorney for the President of the United States said recently, the truth is not the truth. That's Rudy Giuliani, that's a direct quote. The question of who has the authority to determine what the truth is? How do we know when the truth has been stated? And did Paul Simon really distill all of this when he said, one man's ceiling is another man's floor? So I've asked each of my guests to share some opening thoughts with us about the quest for truth, the definition of truth in their work experiences. So who would like to begin? KATHRYN, I knew you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, in philosophy, we are trying to investigate big, important questions that are very complicated, and we take for granted that there are objectively true answers to these questions.
You take for granted.
Well, yeah, we are. At least we think that there are.
Okay.
Yeah, we think that there are.
Okay.
I'm not sure that we can prove that, but
Okay.
yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So we, by and large, philosophers are committed to the idea that there are objective truths, at least true things about some, or true answers to some questions, we could say. Not all questions have true answers, right? But in philosophy, we are trying to use argumentation and different methods of reasoning to get closer to true answers to the questions that we ask. So I'm interested in questions like, what kind of equality does justice require, right? And so that involves thinking about what sort of equality people find valuable, and what people are entitled to. Not just what we think and have enshrined in our Constitution, but what might be true beyond that. But like reasoning in our everyday lives, philosophers are really limited. We're limited because we don't have access to the information we really need to know that things are true, and so we're looking at the evidence that we do have and trying to interpret it the best that we can. And so we try to abide by a principle of non-contradiction, and we try to be consistent across cases. So if we think something is true in one case, then we should think it's true in another case that's similar in all relevant ways. And then we look for coherence. It's evidence in favor of a proposition that it coheres with our other values and other things that we take to be true. But truth can seem very subjective because this process is something that's filtered through all of our minds. We have to perceive the evidence, and we have to interpret it and talk to other people about how they perceive and interpret it. This can be especially problematic when we think about how other beliefs and values and moods and social positioning affect the way that we perceive things and the way that we interpret things. So that raises questions about social disadvantage and advantage, and who we find credible, what sort of social identities we think are credible relative to others. And sometimes these biases are implicit, and we don't know they're influencing us. And so in philosophy, we try to be aware of them, but we don't always succeed.
Thank you. Sarah?
Wow, how do I follow that?
You don't. You just tell us
Yeah,
what you
so
do.
I mean, I'll tell a little bit about who I am and what I do, because I think all of us come from very different backgrounds, educationally and in our work spheres. And so right now, as Sam said, for the past 10 years, I've worked in the area of student affairs and in higher education. So working with college students outside of the classroom. As you all know, as anyone who has gone to college or knows about college knows, is that a very small part of your life in college is spent in class. Obviously, outside of class, there's a lot of things that happen studying for those classes, but also your jobs, your relationships, getting involved in co-curricular activities, so that could be student clubs and organizations, fraternity and sorority life, sports. So my work for the past decade has been to support students in that realm, their lives outside of the classroom. Now, for the past year and a half, I've been working in the area of Title IX at San Diego State University. Majority of my time before that was in university housing. So I lived where the students lived. I worked with them at 2 in the morning when we're all in our pajamas and there's a toilet that's overflowing, or when they're in serious mental health crisis, contemplating suicide, and I need to get them connected to both the police or off campus in a hospital. That work, along with my doctorate research, which is about how women understand themselves as leaders, specifically focusing on college women, led me to this position that I have now. And the majority of my work now, Title IX applies to all federally funded educational institutions, K through higher ed. And what it says at its core is universities who receive federal funding or education that receives federal funding cannot discriminate on the basis of gender. Now, during the Obama administration, there was a push to say, under Title IX, we need to see these, violations of sexual misconduct, sexual violence, relationship violence, and stalking. Universities have to take that and I keep going back to universities because that's my framework, but K through 12 too. education has to take those complaints seriously and help those students who have come forward to report. In addition to that, education has to make a lot of information available through trainings, through online resources. We cannot have educational systems where people feel like they cannot come forward, or if they do come forward, we cannot have them feel like they won't be supported and they won't be believed. And so that led to, and just in general, kind of the shift in our culture is moving more and more towards people are recognizing that's what happens to them is wrong. So if they are emotionally abused, physically abused in relationships, if they have a sexual experience that feels uncomfortable, but they're not quite able to know why, or maybe they do know exactly why it was uncomfortable for them, because they recognize that what happened to them was assault. People are coming forward, and so more and more colleges and universities are putting forward effort, or people like myself, resources, etc., to make sure that students feel supported. And so when I am in my position, majority of the students that I work with are just seeking resources. I help them get connected to college, to our counselors on campus. I help them, navigate their classes. So we recognize that when someone has experienced something like sexual violence, it's going to affect all parts of their life. Their feelings of safety, their performance in classes, their relationships with their boyfriends, girlfriends, significant others, their family members. I help them get connected to all the resources on campus that we can. And so that varies from student to student. In addition to that, a smaller percentage of my work is doing investigations. And so in an investigation, I'm interviewing people who are making the complaint or coming forward with a report of sexual violence, sexual harassment, stalking, relationship violence. And then I'm interviewing the people who are responding to that complaint. We call them respondents. And trying to find, where does the evidence lead us? Now, I do not have a formal education or background in law like my friend to the left, which I'm sure your experience will be very different, but I feel like a lot of what we do, I imagine, is very similar. You're trying to use, as KATHRYN was talking about, in an unbiased as possible, right? And she was talking about implicit biases, so checking those. Having an unbiased, impartial investigation. Where do the facts lead us? And so that is, and judging credibility of the witnesses, credibility of the complainant and the respondent, which is all tricky. At the end of the day, what one person believes and what another person believes is often very different. Very different. I have people come in who are responding to a complaint of sexual violence, and they said, but I thought she was into it. But I thought he was okay with that. We try and use those moments as an educational moment to say, in fact, this person wasn't okay with it. They did not want to move forward with that, and yet it still went on. And so using our process to not only educate, but hold people accountable for their actions under the definitions of sexual violence and relationship violence and stalking that all of the CSU system uses, so all 23 campuses. At the end of the day, sometimes there's going to be, as for many things, there's a lot of different truths. And so I'm looking to see, where does the evidence lead us? Sometimes it leads us to, I can find this person responsible for sexual assault, and sometimes I can't. I just don't have enough evidence. And that's a tough conversation to have too, especially with the person who's come forward. They're all very hard conversations. I feel for every person that comes into my office, whether they are on the complainant side, bringing forward the complaint, or responding to that complaint.
That's great, Sarah.
Yeah.
I want to give David.
So sorry, yeah.
Got you rolling here.
No, I was in the zone.
No, I know
Sorry,
that
David.
happens. We talk about what we do when we get in the zone.
Dude,
I do that every day at work,
Yeah.
yes. That's why I'm here.
Thank you.
David.
No need to apologize. There's so much to talk about and so much to think about. You know, from the judicial perspective, from the court perspective. From the court perspective? From the court perspective.
Yeah.
Thank you. From the court perspective, I'm not a philosopher, so I would pose the questions that we normally get asked and try to answer to get to the truth, to the bottom of it. Who done it? What happened? And those are very simple questions that mask the infinite complexity of human relationships.
Taylor, hold the mic closer to you.
We have in the court system dealt with problematic human situations for a long time, and things have changed over the years. We've watched the attitudes towards domestic violence and the handling of those cases, stalking. Sexual misconduct cases are not new. We have dealt with it in the context of child molest. These are extremely complicated cases. And so what does the justice system do? And I think one of the things that we're asking ourselves now as we look at some of the Title IX procedures that were just described for you, do they afford due process? Because in the court and in the judicial model, it's the process that matters. And by process, I mean you have to study and think about what are the impediments to getting to the truth. How do you overcome those things? How do you institutionalize them in a way that guarantees your best chance of arriving at the truth? So it begins and ends with the impartiality of the decision maker, having an open mind, having a requirement that you have an open mind. And if that ever became more painfully obvious as being a necessity, current events have certainly led to that, right? We have people on record as saying, in response to a question, do you think she was telling the truth? Who cares? We won. That's antithetical to what we're trying to accomplish in a justice system and reaching a just result. I had a discussion with an 87-year-old woman, a very bright woman, very with it. We were talking about some of the issues that I think this play is going to characterize for you and demonstrate for you. And she said at the end of the conversation, it's always the girl's fault. Think about that. Think about the people that say, you know, when people complain in the courts about the absence of due process in these Title IX investigations. And I've got a half a dozen headlines from major news organizations in the last month talking about the need for the courts to rescue the male victims from the lack of due process. Think about that when people say, well, what does an accused in this kind of circumstance need due process for? It's at that time, I think, when the court system, in searching for an impartial decision maker, will always ask the question, and I think it's something we as a society need to ask ourselves, what's more important to you, your belief system, your politics, or a search for the truth? So the process needs to be geared towards search for the truth, and we do that in our system of justice through an accusatorial system, which is a little different than what happens in Europe, what happens in Title IX investigations, which is essentially an inquisitorial, where one person does the investigation, one person makes the credibility judgments, one person makes the determinations. In an accusatorial system, we gather evidence, we share the evidence, we force people to demonstrate the evidence to one another, we give an opportunity for the evidence to be tested through some form of cross-examination. We have the opportunity then to present evidence in contrast. The person that, or persons, the judge or the jury, who are the ultimate decision makers, are not the ones that have been involved in personally conducting the investigation. They then look at and assess credibility in all the different ways that we've talked about. There is an opportunity to question. Every procedure in a due process is geared towards fairness, Every procedure in due process is a balance. Every time that you take into consideration the damage that's been done to the alleged victim, and you take into consideration how that person needs to be treated and supported, there is a corresponding loss to the other side of the equation. Every time that you insist on fairness and the ability to cross-examination for the ability to cross-examine for a defendant, the victim, the alleged victim, has to suffer another trauma of sorts. Thinking about the process and deciding what we want, how we want it, how much proof is enough in advance of any particular one case is what we feel is the best way to arrive at justice in an individual case. There are so many questions and so many nuances here to examine.
Sure. Yeah, that's fascinating. I want to ask you a really simple thing. I'm a simple guy. How often do you get it right in the judicial system? Our system. How often does it get? Is the determination the truthful determination?
So the question, if I could rephrase it, is how often do we have confidence that we know the unknowable?
Good. I knew there was a better question.
I think the question is probably best answered, as most lawyers would do, by weaseling.
Go for it.
I think if you spend any time in the justice system, you have to be impressed, if you're serious, about how imperfect the system is. It's a human system. It's a human system that's designed to attempt to do something that may not be possible, and yet it's designed to get as close as one can to ascertaining the truth. To the extent that you have confidence in your processes, you then have confidence in the result. So to the extent that someone honestly and carefully attempts to pick an impartial jury, rigidly imposes on the well-thought-out rules of evidence what's reliable and what's not reliable, you give a full opportunity to air the evidence with all its warts, good and bad, and you instruct them on what the principles are. I have a great deal of confidence that in most of the situations, spectacular anecdotal exceptions to the contrary, very few, I think we get very close most often. I have a great deal of confidence in the way that the juries proceed. We have specific pockets of problems that are identifiable and are repeat problems, and so sometimes there are new developments in our arsenal that reveal some weaknesses. So the classic is, what about the Innocence Project? People that are wrongly convicted. Well, a lot of that is related to the frailties of human eyewitness identification, especially in a cross-cultural context. And DNA is one of those things that has helped us illustrate that. And now we take steps to improve in that area. And so, who knows? It's kind of like, yeah. I mean, and isn't that the $1 million philosophical question?
Which one?
How close do we get to finding the truth?
That's what I was going to ask her next. Kathryn.
That's a really big general question.
No,
How close
but
do we ever get?
I'm interested in the same question. You're in philosophy. I presume that the truth is one of your pursuits. Am I right?
Yeah, for all of us. About very different questions a lot of the time, but the questions here...
How close do you get to the truth is what you're asking, David, right? Yeah.
I mean, it's different in different cases, but
Sure.
when it comes to questions where all of the evidence to be assessed is the perceptions that different people have, then that's a lot tougher than some of the other things that we're looking at, where there's evidence that are empirical facts and also stable convictions and things that we have held to be true for a long time. There's an array of evidence, and I think we can get closer to the truth in those cases. We can be more confident about it. But when it's just perception and our interpretation of our own perceptions, that can be really hard, because what someone believes to be true can be very different from what someone else believes to be true, as Sarah mentioned. And there is a truth about what happened, but it's not directly accessible to any of us, even the people who are present. And so we have to sort of check our perceptions against one another and see if we can agree or see if we can make any progress that way. So, for example, I'm constantly saying things or thinking things like, oh, so-and-so, my colleague, was really short with me and I think was a real jerk to me when I asked him a question about his research. And then I'll have a friend who is present say, actually, I think he was kind of embarrassed and surprised by the question and didn't have
the title of the play there? Actually? You just quoted the title of the play. Go on.
Well, but, he didn't have a good response and he was embarrassed and that's why he was short. And then it really can change my belief about what happened. But if it weren't for that alternative interpretation, I would only have my own experience, and that's not much to work with.
I want to ask you another question about this. In the study of philosophy, are there established, long-held truths that contemporary philosophy has determined are no longer true?
Yeah, that happens.
What would that be?
That are no longer true?
Well, that was my question. You can answer it however you like. Well, you referenced this commonly held, I'm paraphrasing, long held or accepted truth.
But, so you're asking about things that we've revised. And
I am.
Our thinking does evolve. So for a long time, we've thought about equality in terms of distribution of social goods and resources, so material equality. But we're coming more and more to see that that's not the only kind, or even the most important kind of equality. Equality can also be about the status that we have in relation to one another, and we can relate as equals when we interact in various contexts. And so we revise often. But there are things that we hold to be true and we don't revise. These are the stable convictions I mentioned. So something like it's wrong to unnecessarily harm an innocent person. Bedrock.
Looking for my other question. Sarah, does anything spring to your mind here you want to chip in on? It doesn't have to.
Use your mic.
David. I'll use my mic. Thank you. Thank you, Marion. My mic patrol. Okay.
There seems to me to be easy cases and more difficult cases. And in the context of the uncomfortable, awkward sexual interaction, there are easy cases. The easy cases are when someone says yes and ultimately didn't like it, someone who says no and the person ignores. Those we understand. It would seem to me that it's a much more difficult case and much more realistic when you talk about an individual who's participating in an event and they haven't said yes or they haven't said no, and they're actually internally ambivalent. That is, they're not sure. They're not sure what they want. Part says, yes, I like this. Part says, no, I don't like this. I don't want to go here. And searching for the truth in looking at what actually was going on at the time, whether there was consent or not, is very difficult. Because not only is the individual at the time subjectively conflicted, but somehow later on that can be reflected upon in a different light, and they can actually perceive their position differently, and they can be influenced by others to see how they should have been thinking at the time. I think those make for the difficult litigations.
I wanted to say that, yeah, these ambiguous cases, it's really hard because we don't know what each person involved knew. But if instead of consent, we focused on like enthusiastic participation, or like my partner's really enjoying this and they're confirming that they enjoy it and I can see that they enjoy it, if that was our standard and it wasn't just minimal, this minimal like permission, I have permission to act upon this person or something, I think that
Of course,
cases would be
enthusiastic
more
participation is no longer legally sufficient to be consent in the state of California.
Is that right? Is
It
that right?
is. As Janet Napolitano, president of UC, in her law review article proposed and enacted by law in California, only yes is yes.
And I think I don't know if this works. I think it's different for the CSUs. I know that we oftentimes talk about affirmative consent, and so a part of affirmative consent is enthusiastic consent. It's not just, it's not just
An enthusiastic yes.
an enthusiastic yes. The question has to be asked, do you want to continue with XYZ and make it as sexy as you want, right? Like students are like, oh, that's just not sexy. I'm like, well, and so part of our job is teaching them that it can be sexy. And that it is sexy.
You do?
I don't know if this is working. Can you all hear me? I mean, yes. And I think that it blows some students' minds when it's like, no, adults ask each other all the time, like, do you want to do this? And they're like, oh. And it makes me wonder about sexual education in general, right? Because I see students, yes. And I think that as we talk about in my doctorate, like it's a K through 20 or P through 20 pipeline from preschool all the way up to graduate school, right? You have to think of it as a pipeline because if students are not getting comprehensive sexual education and talking about affirmative consent and using it in middle school, high school, when they start having sexual interactions, then they're just going to keep believing that like asking someone if they have a condom is consent. Like, do you want me to use a condom? Okay, that's something that's coming up recently with my cases. It's like, well, I told her I had a condom. Okay.
The education piece is really critical because that 87-year-old woman that I referenced has a relative who's 92. That 92-year-old man taught his daughter that if something happened, it was her fault. That woman has taught her daughter that if something happens, it's likely your fault. And it's perpetuated generation by generation. I talked to you about, I thought was the most harmful statement that was made. I think one of the most promising statements that I've heard made recently is the existence of Girls Too movement. And that focuses in on middle school and the need for education at middle school about what healthy relationships look like. In criminal law, there's a lot of emphasis now on being able to avoid continued criminal conduct, recidivism. It's always now the focus, based upon the research, that criminal thinking is clearly the most important aspect. If you can help someone learn how to think properly, learn how to have empathy, and more importantly, not just have empathy, but actually care about what the other person is feeling, and to think like a normal human being, the less likely you are to have this problem. I think, and that is cognitive behavioral therapy. I think there needs to be a cognitive behavioral revolution in the way that we explain sex to our kids, what their rights are, what their responsibilities are, what it means to be a man, not a predator, what it means to be a man, what a woman should be able to do and say and have control over. Those lessons have to start in middle school.
Yeah. I was thinking about truth when I titled this salon, which is really hard to talk about, I realize. Let me ask you a question. Philosopher. We live in a time when the truth that the issue of who's telling the truth is huge. The president is tracked by the New York Times, which regularly publishes all the false claims he made. There was like a 4-page article the other day. You've seen this, right? It's an amazing list of falsisms, and of course he believes that the left-wing media is completely lying all the time. And then the right-wing media, and then we had the recent trial. So the question of what's true, who gets to decide what is true, in our culture, and the shared perception of what's true is in a whole new arena these days. And I wonder what philosophers think about that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not sure that President Trump thinks that the mainstream media is after him or believes that. I think that's politically motivated.
I think he's not telling
sometimes,
the truth.
yeah, right. I mean, there's honest disagreement when people hold different things to be true, so they believe different things. But then, in many cases, it's just lying, and that's totally different. But the credibility question is really huge because it's the ways in which we decide that whether someone's credible. Those sorts of norms of behavior can often be associated with the way that men are socialized to be, or white people are socialized to be. And so we can have these standards that we think are neutral and we're applying them objectively to different people, but they're really not fair. And so we saw with the hearing with Brett Kavanaugh, it was a real problem that this particular woman was so credible. Because usually, or often, in these high-profile cases, the strategy is just to attack the credibility of the accuser, of the woman who's being accused, and that has worked for a really long time.
I object. I object to the characterization.
You have the floor.
I object to the characterization of what happened as a hearing or a trial. I object to the notion that there was any consideration of evidence, or for that matter, likely any consideration in a significant way of credibility. What we had was an endorsement of belief systems and the opposite of fact-finding or truth-seeking. And so I really think that needs to be viewed as an aberration, a politicization of the search for truth, and it's antithetical to the search for
I
truth.
love the phrase fact-finding. I think that's interesting in this conversation, because what's a fact? You have to agree on what the fact is. Is this room, this floor, and this ceiling a warm room? No?
No.
Yeah. What's the fact?
There's not a
It's
fact
true.
about that. There's not
Why not?
an
What's
objectively
wrong?
true answer.
Why not?
Not unless we have an objective standard of what qualifies as warm that we
According
can
to
agree
who?
on.
According to who?
Well, we would have to
And
agree
by
on it
and by
in
what
some
standard
way,
of
right?
proof?
And what's in it?
Is it
Okay.
warm beyond a reasonable doubt, or by clear and convincing evidence, or preponderance of the evidence, or do you simply have probable cause to suspect?
Well, we have to distinguish between different types of questions. Some questions are matters of preferences. Some questions there are many equally good answers that we can
Yes.
choose from,
Yeah.
and some answers have objectively true, like things
Yeah.
that have happened in the world. There's a true fact about those. There's true facts about those.
Yeah, those hurricanes that people talk about, they're
The
real?
world is round. Yeah.
Climate change.
Climate change, oh yeah, right. We all agree climate change is a fact.
But could we agree, rather than saying this room is warm, this room is subject to the laws of gravity? Well, there could be a question raised, and I'm sure that certain people of a certain political persuasion would say there is no gravity. That's false. That's fake news. But if we have a process by which evidence is introduced, we have a standard of proof that we're going to look at, and we look at the evidence, I think I have fairly strong confidence that we'll arrive at the truth that this room is subject to the law of gravity.
Yeah, that isn't what I asked, but yeah.
But you see, if you can't simply say, is an opinion true, as opposed to the determination of whether certain facts have occurred. There's something more concrete.
Isn't it true, though, in our culture that some people are claiming that facts are opinions? That people are, or vice versa? I mean, the president does that all the time. He states things as if they're a fact and they're not. They're a speculation, or you call it a lie. Basically, it's made up. I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm just curious about what truth is. Yes, Sarah.
Okay, so
I need help.
I think, no, I was just thinking about this idea of truth, and I'm not a philosopher, but I do know that I talk to people every day. And I do know and have noted a change over the years, but also through these Kavanaugh hearings, or this hearing, or maybe not a hearing, you're saying it, whatever it was called. Job interview, thank you. And what is just so astounding is people accepting their truth. People have realized as we become more educated, as our society is changing, that whatever they experienced, whether it be an unhealthy relationship, whether it be that they were raped, whether it be that they were molested as children, people are coming to that realization of their personal truth. And that in itself is incredibly empowering to see people. I know people, family included, that joke about the Me Too movement, but for me it's incredibly empowering to see women and men, and really people of all genders, looking at one another and being like, holy cow, you get me on a level that other people just don't. When you have experienced something so traumatic, whether it be sexual assault or rape or even sexual harassment, an unwelcome comment, or someone touching you in a way that makes you feel strange, when you find someone who gets it, that's a feeling that I know I felt it myself, and I'm sure many of us in the room have, when someone gets you on a level that's so deep. And so if anything beautiful has come of this, it's people being more open with themselves about what they've experienced and connecting with others who have experienced that too.
You know, I like to end on beautiful things, so I think given that it's 7:43, the show starts at 8 o'clock, I think we will end on that. There's no end to this conversation. Oh, by the way, let's wrap it up and tell everybody what the truth is. Sorry, it's not going to happen. But I'm going to thank David and Sara and KATHRYN for being my guests. This is Sam's Salon. The next salon will be looking at feminism in the 19th century and what happened 100 years later, through the eyes of a scholar, a Heinrich Ibsen scholar, when we do the production of A Doll's House Part 2, and looking at feminism 100 years apart. It's in November. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.